Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I covered Rosecrans' life from his campaigns in Western Virginia until the Second Battle of Corinth. Now, Rosecrans becomes commander of the Army of the Cumberland, formerly the Army of the Ohio. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The day after the Second Battle of Corinth, Rosecrans mounted a pursuit of Earl Van Dorn's Confederate army, with Rosecrans remaining at Corinth to stay in communication with Ulysses S. Grant, who was supposed to be sending help. Help was on the way. Grant sent Stephen Hurlbut to assist Rosecrans. Old Rosie's marching columns ran into significant trouble when problems with maps and guides resulted in some divisions taking the wrong roads. Nevertheless, they nearly overtook Van Dorn's troops. Hurlbut caught Van Dorn, but the Confederate general was able to disengage and get away. When matters were handled at Corinth, Rosecrans rode to the front. He still wanted his army to pursue Van Dorn. As the Union troops followed close behind the retreating rebels, Rosecrans saw debris strewn along the road. One soldier wrote, "The road was strewed with tents, wagons, and clothing, knapsacks, sugar, molasses, flour, and cornmeal, besides cooking utensils, cannon carriage, and ammunition and guns. I did not see any cannon, but it was reported that our scouts found 10 pieces of cannon thrown into a gully 1/2 mile off the road." Another wrote, "Artillery caissons had struck trees, and the ammunition exploded, tearing everything to pieces around. Many places the cannoneers had cut the traces and gone, leaving their load behind. The hillsides were white with cornmeal and flour and dust on the road fully 1 foot deep. Thus for several miles it went. We found General Price's buggy with a fine robe in it, but the owner had gone on. All along the roadside, under bushes, in the hollers, and behind logs, the panting fugitives were found glad to surrender." At Crumb's Mill, Rosecrans sent a message to Grant. It read, "Out of rations, having followed the main column of the precipitate retreat of the enemy, Hurlbut reports himself out of position and too much crippled to follow the enemy. I have ordered rations sent to Cyprus for him, and have begged him not to return to Bolivar until I can communicate with Sherman. I want him to appear to threaten the enemy. I think Sherman should go to Holly Springs by all means, and that the road should be open to take supplies to him. Think it could be done without much trouble. I repeat, it is of the utmost importance to give the enemy no rest day or night, but push him to Mobile or Jackson. Beg the authorities north to send us more troops. Ship everything you can. Now is our time. We must give the enemy no time to reinforce or recruit. Every nerve must be strained. Everything will be sent to see that our troops lack nothing of the necessities to keep them going." In response to Rosecrans' pleading, Grant ordered Rosecrans to stop the pursuit and withdraw. Undeterred by the order to stop, Rosecrans again wrote to Grant saying, "I must deploy dissent from your views as to the manner of pursuing. We have defeated, routed, and demoralized the army which holds the lower Mississippi Valley. We have the 2 railroads leading down toward the Gulf through the most productive parts of the state, into which we can now pursue them with safety. The effect of our return to old position will be to pin them up in the only corn country they have west of Alabama, including the Tuscumbia Valley, and to permit them to recruit their forces, advance and occupy their old ground, reducing us to the occupation of a defensive position, barren and worthless, with a long front over which they can harass us until bad weather prevents an effectual advance except on the railroads, when time, fortifications, and rolling stock will again render them superior to us." Grant was now faced with a decision to make, so he sent that information up the chain to Henry Halleck. In an uncharacteristic move for the man who abandoned the pursuit of P.G.T. Beauregard when that general evacuated Corinth, Halleck asked, "Why order a return of our troops? Why not reinforce Rosecrans and pursue the enemy into Mississippi, supporting your army on the country?" The questions posed by Halleck didn't keep Grant from reaffirming the order to Rosecrans to stop the pursuit and withdraw back to Corinth. Rosecrans would say to a member of his staff, "The whole rebel army of the West, and certainly the whole flower of it, is in our front, whipped and demoralized. We could drive them like a flock of sheep. It seems to me that the time has come to win the war in the West, if not the central zone." The next day, Rosecrans' army began its movement back to Corinth. Upon his return, he was informed that he had been promoted to Major General of Volunteers, but the date was from September. Rosecrans believed he should have been given the promotion because of his service in Western Virginia, so the date should have been earlier in the year. During the back and forth between Grant and Rosecrans, Grant rebuked Rosecrans for communicating with William T. Sherman at Memphis because that didn't follow the chain of command. Rosecrans protested that he was simply alerting Sherman of the Confederate threat and asked for cooperation and didn't attempt to order Sherman to do anything. The situation still irritated Grant. Rosecrans, on top of being promoted, would be transferred to a different command, away from Grant. When Grant received the news, he came out of his tent holding a piece of paper outlining the transfer and said his great trouble had been resolved. Rosecrans headed to Cincinnati to await his next orders. He wouldn't wait long. Union commander of the Army of the Ohio, Don Carlos Buell, was to be replaced following the Battle of Perryville that occurred in early October 1862. Buell failed to follow up on his victory, and many called for him to be replaced. The Department of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio, soon to be the Army of the Cumberland, would be commanded by Rosecrans. As Buell left his now former command, he expressed concern over George H. Thomas, his second in command. Thomas was second in command of the Army and outranked Rosecrans by date. Thomas said that he had no objection to serving under Rosecrans, but didn't want to be passed over by a junior in rank. He wrote to Rosecrans saying, "There is no one under whom I would more willingly serve than you, but under the circumstances I trust you will cooperate by getting me transferred to Texas." Rosecrans respected Thomas and didn't want him to leave that army. Abraham Lincoln moved Rosecrans' date of promotion to March, which meant that he outranked Thomas, and that settled the matter. Rosecrans asked Thomas if he wanted to remain second in command as more of an administrative position, or be given a command. Thomas jumped at the chance to be given a command in the Army of the Cumberland. The Army was encamped in and around Bowling Green, Kentucky. Rosecrans made his headquarters at a home in the town, but the lady who owned the home didn't like her house being used as Army headquarters. The heavy-booted officers, dirty from constant use, traipsed through her home and over her carpet. One night, in protest, she began pulling up the carpet. Rosecrans ordered the carpet put back down, which was complied with. In an act of revenge, the lady flavored the barrel of drinking water with soap. Rosecrans got a little ill from drinking it, but recovered. With that, the war between Rosecrans and the lady of the house ended. The Army of the Cumberland numbered around 75,000 men present for duty, but they were undisciplined from the viewpoint of Rosecrans. More horrendous was the state of the Union cavalry. Confederate cavalry in the department under Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler were more active and better at causing havoc than his own cavalry. So he set about improving the mounted arm of his army. He ordered 2,500 breech-loading or revolving weapons for his cavalry and endeavored to get them into fighting shape. Half of them were without weapons at all. A review of the army was held, and Rosecrans inspected them by brigade. He came up to one regiment and said, "Boys, when you drill, drill like thunder. Don't try how not to do it." When he saw a private with his knapsack on crooked, he called out, "Captain, I'm sorry to see that you don't know how to strap a knapsack on your shoulder's back." The captain called back, "But I didn't do it, General." Rosecrans responded, "Oh, you didn't? Well then, hereafter you had better do it yourself or see that it is done correctly." Desertion was up in the army, and Rosecrans wanted it to end as soon as possible, so he decided to make an example out of deserters. A lieutenant from a regiment in the Army of the Cumberland deserted and went to southern Illinois. When he wrote back to his troops telling them how to desert without getting caught, Rosecrans ordered the man to be arrested and brought back in chains, which he was. He was court-martialed and sentenced to death for his actions. However, like the lenient Abraham Lincoln, Rosecrans reduced his sentence after terrifying the officer, then had him brought in front of his command. His sword was removed, his rank ripped off, and he was driven from the ranks. Shirkers straggled and allowed themselves to get caught, expecting to be paroled. So Rosecrans ordered all paroled men to wear the cheapest and ugliest nightcaps home as a symbol of their laziness in the army. By humiliating both deserters and shirkers, Rosecrans drastically reduced the number of both in the Army of the Cumberland. In early November, the Army moved into Nashville, its base of operations. The citizenry of the city was divided as to their loyalty. The Unionists cheered as the Union Army moved down their streets, and the secessionists demonstrated their disdain in many ways, particularly the women. Women needed passes to go in and out of the city. Rebel women wanted these passes to smuggle food, medicine, and even Confederates out of or into the city. Rosecrans, as chief of military police, warned his commander and others, "Don't trust women." When the general staff refused to give out passes, the women launched what was called a petticoat blockade, where they blocked the hallways until their demands were met. Many of them wanted to see Rosecrans. The general welcomed them into his office, but they usually didn't leave the office happy. He would sniff out their true intentions for passes and simply hand them over to his staff. On one occasion, a lady came into Rosecrans's office and wanted a pass. The general wanted her to take the oath of allegiance before she left his office. She stated that she couldn't do that because she didn't believe in swearing. Old Rosie refused to let her leave. So she said, "Well, General, if I must swear, I will, but all the sin of the oath must rest upon your shoulders." Then she commenced to cursing Rosecrans and the Union Army. The lady was then led away. It was difficult to supply his troops in Nashville because of the constant harassment of the railroad line from Kentucky to Nashville. Rails were removed, heated up, and bent in all kinds of directions. Water tanks were destroyed, and wood for fuel burned up. Much of this chaos came from Confederate Cavalry Commander John Hunt Morgan. Rosecrans, upon hearing of the destruction, roared, "Morgan has sent over a lot of soldiers in citizens' dress to loaf around and injure the railroad. Whoever cannot give a good account of themselves, shoot or hang them on the nearest tree." As Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland refitted and gathered supplies at Nashville, the Confederate Army of Tennessee under Braxton Bragg was on the move toward Nashville, and by early December, Bragg was at Murfreesboro, about 30 miles from Nashville. Rosecrans proposed a plan to wait for rains to raise the Tennessee River to allow for Union gunboats to support a movement against Bragg. Then he would fall on Bragg and trap him against the river. However, Washington had other plans. Rosecrans received this message: "The President is very impatient at your long stay in Nashville. Twice have I been asked to designate someone else to command your army. If you remain one more week at Nashville, I cannot prevent your removal. The government demands action." Rosecrans responded, "Many of our soldiers are to this day barefoot, without blankets, without tents, without good arms, and cavalry without horses. Our true objective now is the enemy's force, for if they come near, we save wear, tear, risk, and strength. Subject them to what we escape, and gain all the chances to be expected from a rise in the river. I need no other stimulus to make me do my duty than the knowledge of what it is. To the threats of removal or the like, I must be permitted to say that I am insensible." Since the release of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln and his cabinet were looking for a victory, and the stationary Rosecrans, although having just taken over, was expected to win a victory, as he had done in both western Virginia and northern Mississippi. A victory was also needed to hopefully block international interference. Henry Halleck wrote to Rosecrans, "You can hardly conceive this great anxiety about it. I will tell you what it is, although it is only a guess on my part. It has been feared that on the meeting of the British Parliament in January next, the political pressure of the starving operators may force the government to join France in an intervention. If the enemy be left in possession of Middle Tennessee, which we held last July, it will be said that they have gained on us. Tennessee is the only state which can be used as an argument in favor of intervention by England. Your movements have an importance beyond mere military success. It was hoped and believed when you took the command that you would recover all lost ground by, at furthest, the middle of December, so that it would be known in London soon after the meeting of Parliament. A victory or the retreat of the enemy before the 10th of this month would have been of more value to us than 10 times that success at a later date. General Buell was too slow to be in time, hence the change." Rosecrans wrote to his wife saying, "The administration expects much of me. I have a bad country to advance over, but my hopes are all in God. I work about 18 hours a day. I am in hopes of beginning to move very soon with the intention of moving rapidly and continuously. The next battle in this department is likely to decide the war. There must be no failure. I will not move until I am ready." Rosecrans read from Confederate papers that John Hunt Morgan had gotten married at Murfreesboro and that Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, had attended. The President informed Bragg that he must hold Middle Tennessee at all costs. Old Rosie would write to Halleck saying, "Things will be ripe soon." Indeed they were. By December 21st, two things were in Rosecrans's favor for an advance against the Confederate Army at Murfreesboro. First, between 20 and 30 days' rations had been stockpiled in Nashville to support the Army in such a movement away from their base of operations. Second, Bragg had sent away a large section of his cavalry, John Hunt Morgan into Kentucky, and Nathan Bedford Forrest into West Tennessee. Rosecrans's cavalry was inferior and outnumbered by their rebel counterparts, but now, with a great segment of the Confederate cavalry gone, The mounted arm of both armies were more evenly matched. On Christmas night, Rosecrans called his commanders together: Thomas Crittenden, Alexander McCook, Philip Sheridan, and David S. Stanley. Although Rosecrans did not consult with these men, when George Thomas came in and settled himself heavy in the narrow space between the bed and the front window, Rosecrans pulled up a chair facing him. Swiftly and earnestly he unfolded his plan, his animated face almost touching the grave, bearded face of his friend. He talked rapidly, in an undertone, sometimes grasping the seat of the chair, sometimes tapping against it. Thomas nodded now and then, or injected a few words. The younger generals glanced from time to time at the favored confidant, but no one ever seemed jealous of Thomas. At the end of the discussion, Rosecrans slammed his mug on a table and said, "We move tomorrow, gentlemen. We shall begin to skirmish probably as soon as we pass the outposts. Press them hard. Drive them out of their nests. Make them fight or run. Fight them. Fight them. Fight, I say." The squeaking of leather and the stomping of boots on the roads leading out of Nashville filled the air as the Army of the Cumberland marched southeast along mostly parallel roads, hoping to catch the Army of Tennessee divided so they could defeat it in detail. The divisions did as Rosecrans asked. They drove the Confederate skirmishers out of their nest and pushed them hard. However, weather interrupted some of the movement. A heavy fog reduced the visibility, and the winter rains muddied the roads. The Union soldiers pressed on, but at a slower pace than Rosecrans expected. Nevertheless, Rosecrans's troops pushed all the way to the outskirts of Murfreesboro, where they encountered Bragg's army, prepared to resist the crossing of Stone's River. Crittenden's third of the army was supposed to capture the town and hold it with one division, but the amount of enemy troops convinced him otherwise, and he sought to consult with Rosecrans. Rosecrans agreed that Crittenden did the right thing by not advancing the sole division against the concentrated rebel army. The Union army moved ever so closer to the Confederate counterpart, and as Rosecrans monitored the heavy skirmishing in his front, a sharpshooter bullet hit an aide next to him. Undeterred, he remained at the location, watching his men move forward. While in that dangerous location, 2 Confederate artillery shells hit near Rosecrans. One decapitated a soldier near him, and the other exploded close by the commander. Rosecrans wisely chose to move he and his staff a little further away from the action. From the time Rosecrans took command of the Army of the Cumberland, he petitioned Washington for more cavalry to match the experienced Confederate horsemen. They hadn't heeded the general's warnings, so as the army advanced toward the enemy, Joseph Wheeler's cavalry rode around his army, cutting communications, and destroying nearly $1 million in army property. Rosecrans hoped that this example would lead Washington to realize the need for more and better equipped horsemen. Rosecrans's own cavalry had to be used for scouting and guarding the flanks, and therefore couldn't be concentrated to combat the enemy cavalry because of its minuscule size. By December 30th, the Army of the Cumberland was concentrated along the banks of Stone's River, with the Army of Tennessee directly in front of them. Rosecrans believed that a fight would happen the next day, either initiated by him or the enemy. He gave his commanders their orders and rested, for the next day would be filled with battle. In the early morning of December 31st, Rosecrans awoke before his staff and began to arouse them. A staffer brought him his favorite horse, a strong gray steed named Boney. Light musketry quickly gave way to intense volleys and blasts from artillery on the Union right. Soon, bursting through the cedars, came mules, wagons, slaves, fugitives, and soldiers. Staffers rode toward the chaotic mass of humanity and demanded to know what had happened. They informed Rosecrans' staffers that the right flank had been broken and cavalry were now in their rear. McCook misled Rosecrans when he reported that his men were being pressed hard. In reality, the line was broken, and what was left was streaming toward the Nashville pike. Rosecrans calmly said, "Never mind, we will rectify it." The situation only grew worse as the rebel brigades began swarming past the right flank and driving into the rear of the Union army, threatening to cut Rosecrans off from Nashville by capturing the Nashville pike. Rosecrans, with a clenched, unlit cigar in his mouth, began moving troops from his left to support his right. With help from his trusted subordinate George Thomas, they began to cobble together a line that was holding off the rebel onslaught. Union soldiers under Philip Sheridan and a few others were holding out in a limestone outcropping later named the Slaughter Pen, and were buying Rosecrans and Thomas enough time to shift troops to the Nashville pike. Rosecrans remained within close proximity of the fighting, personally placing troops alongside his aides. Bullets hit men near him, but Rosecrans didn't flinch. His speech became erratic as he became excited and anxious by the chaos unfolding around him. At one point, one of his aides became greatly concerned about the exposure to enemy bullets. Rosecrans announced, "Never mind me. Make the sign of the cross and go in." Concerned about his left flank, Rosecrans rode over to the brigade guarding the ford across Stone's River on his left and asked its commander, "Will you hold this ford?" "I will try, sir," answered the colonel. "Will you hold this ford?" Rosecrans asked again. "I will die right here," the colonel said. "Will you hold this ford?" "Yes, sir," the colonel replied. Rosecrans then nodded and said, "That will do." Then he turned his horse to ride back to the threatened right flank. A Union soldier remembered Rosecrans, moved calmly, cheering and inspiring our faltering troops, and throughout the day, wherever the battle raged most fiercely, General Rosecrans bore his charmed life. Another said Rosecrans was at all parts of the field, mounted on a large gray horse, his old blue overcoat buttoned to his chin, a stump of cigar caught between his teeth. He left the position usually occupied by the chief and came to the line of battle, and by his presence and words cheered and encouraged the men of the center and left. One of Rosecrans' staffers wrote, "When disaster had enveloped half the army, and from that time to the end Rosecrans was magnificent, rising superior to the disaster that in a single moment had annihilated his carefully prepared plans. He grasped in his single hands the fortunes of the day. He stemmed the tide of retreat, hurried brigades and divisions to the point of danger, massed artillery and fused into them his own dauntless spirit, and out of defeat itself fashioned the weapons of victory. As at Cheat Mountain, Iuka, and Corinth, it was his personal presence that magnetized his plans into success." An Indiana soldier reported about Rosecrans that "he is as brave as Julius Caesar. I saw him while riding to and fro at furious rates, the sweat pouring down his face, his clothes splattered over with blood, and I could not help but expressing my gratitude to Providence for having given us a man that was equal to the occasion, a general in fact as well as in name." The stubborn Philip Sheridan emerged from the cedar brake with what was left of his command. They were broken, out of ammunition, and Sheridan was furious. His face was blackened from the discharge of powder. He came up to Rosecrans, who was calmly astride his horse. Rosecrans said, "Watch your language. Remember, the first bullet may send you to eternity." Sheridan shot back, "I can't help it. Unless I swear like hell, the men won't take me seriously." Pointing to his broken ranks, he explained, "This is all that is left, General." Rosecrans pointed toward the Nashville pike and said, "Crittenden's train is still intact. Replenish your ammunition and get your men back into the fight. Hazen has his hands full at the end of the Round Forest. Support him." Some of the last attacks that came on December 31st came at the Round Forest, a vulnerable point in Rosecrans' center where the line bent at a nearly 90-degree angle. A huge artillery barrage peppered the area from the Confederate guns, and wanting to make sure the line held personally, Rosecrans rode off for the Round Forest. The troops in that sector needed encouragement, and Rosecrans was bent on giving it to them. As he and his staff galloped toward the forest, an artillery shell exploded, and the projectile hit one of Rosecrans' favorite staffers, Julius P. Goresche, in the face, carrying away his head, leaving only the lower half of his jaw. The body rode for about 20 paces until the horse jerked and the body fell off. When Rosecrans was notified of his death, he remarked, "I am very sorry. We cannot help it. Brave men die in battle. Let us push on. This battle must be won." He remarked later, "I had no sensation under fire at Stone's River. I was absorbed in planning how to beat the enemy." The death of his favorite aide did weigh on him. He would cut the buttons off of his coat and place them in an envelope which read, "Buttons I wore the day Goresche was killed." Blood from aides and soldiers covered Rosecrans' uniform, making his subordinates ask repeatedly if he was wounded. Rosecrans had to keep reassuring them that he was unhurt. One aide carried the general's uneaten lunch in a haversack through most of the battle. Old Rosie didn't have time to eat during the brutal fight. During the last half of the day, an artillery shell ripped the man's trousers and split open the haversack. The aide said, "Now, all the dinner's gone," which got a big laugh from all standing around him. That night, Rosecrans called his Grand Division commanders and cavalry commander to his headquarters. He asked each of them what they thought should be done, retreat or fight. Crittenden declined to suggest anything because he was the junior and would support anything ordered by Rosecrans. McCook thought they should fight it out. Thomas said he would support the commanding general in his decision, and Stanley agreed with McCook. After a 2-hour ride to see about an avenue of retreat, Rosecrans came back to the headquarters and said, "Well, gentlemen, we shall not retreat, but fight it out here and to the front." Go at once to your posts, and hold your commands ready to receive any attack from the enemy. We shall not attempt to attack him until the arrival of our ammunition, which I have ordered up from Nashville." The group of men were dismissed to attend to their lines, and the new year 1863 came about. Aside from some light skirmishing, nothing major happened on January 1st, 1863 on the Stones River battlefield. On January 2nd, not to be outdone, Braxton Bragg ordered John C. Breckinridge's division to attack Rosecrans' left flank across Stones River. The rebel division pushed back Union troops positioned on the flank, but soon came within sight of the 58 artillery pieces assembled by Rosecrans in anticipation of a Confederate attack in that sector. When those cannons belched forth their concert of death, the Confederate attack broke up and sought safety. One Union officer wrote, "The rebels were put to flight, and old Rosie came galloping down the pike where we lay, the sweat pouring down his face, and sent for Colonel Carlin. He told Carlin the enemy was routed and ordered him to advance with his brigade and pursue them. His exact words to Carlin were, 'I beg you, for the sake of the country, and for my own sake, to go at them with all your might. Go at them with a whoop and a yell.' I had the honor of leading my little regiment in the advance." The Battle of Stones River was a defeat for Braxton Bragg and his Army of Tennessee. Rosecrans averted defeat by acting promptly and energetically to establish a line at the Nashville Pike, and on January 2nd, he obliterated a Confederate division with well-placed artillery. Bragg and his troops marched away from Murfreesboro toward Tullahoma, Tennessee.